An oft heard quote in the past few years is that I didn't leave the left left me. Well, you could update that with that which I've heard over the past several months frequently, in that as a lifelong Democrat or as a left-leaning centrist, the Democratic Party doesn't speak for me anymore. And to be clear, and for many on both sides of the Atlantic, it's very unclear, actually, what the left even politically stands for anymore. Going all the way back to the early 1990s and with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the anti-capitalist economic preoccupations of the old left in the Western world, and in particular in the United States, collapsed with it. And this form of political advocacy against exploitation began to take a back seat to a newly concocted way of understanding oppression. That is, the politics of redistribution was replaced by a politics of recognition. And with this transformation, modern identity politics was born, and with its strange birth began the replacement in principles and guiding ethos of the Democratic Party. According to political philosopher Sonia Crux, and this is her ideas roughly, what makes identity politics a significant departure from earlier movements is the demand, not for inclusion within the fold of universal humankind, nor is it for respect in spite of one's differences. Rather, what is demanded is respect for oneself as different. This rise of identity politics, and with it the hierarchy of victimhood, also necessitates an outgroup, an oppressor. And the Democrats have found that group in the majority ethnic group of America, and specifically that of white men. They rail on and on and on endlessly about supremacy, misogyny, colonialism, reparations. They spiel a never-ending cacophony of guilt and direct their litany of shame accordingly, at least in their own minds. This is the reason for their disbelief and complete cognitive dissonance when events such as the win by Donald Trump of the presidency occurred in 2016. In their minds, they think to themselves, how could a majority of white women go against their gender? And the question rolls around in their mind in a haze of confusion, and they ask themselves, how could they vote this way? Well, in the new tribalized America, they see politics as a zero-sum game with white men versus everyone else. And with this in mind, the Democrats will huff and puff in their befuddled confusion. In a strange way, many of them still believe in the economics of redistribution, but cannot see that their ideology of recognition has long ago overshadowed any and all other influences left within their party. Impulses that a growing number of people, both black and white actually, are beginning to recognize as toxic. Many confused and quite simply delusional Democrats still cling to the idea, or should I say, the fantasy, that they represent the true interests of the American working class, and that blue-collar voters who support the GOP, and especially in the 2016 race, have been somehow hoodwinked or tricked, or most likely bamboozled, if you will. Reality still hasn't set in for many of these people, and they still are not cognizant of the fact that during the last election cycle, the Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton was quite simply a career political technocrat that was openly disdainful of a large percentage of the population, and that percentage of the population was ironically made up mostly of white middle class and white working class voters. And she called them deplorables. But in her mind, this same demographic should, like many that make up the Democrat Party faithful, these people should also choose self-hatred over self-interest. And when she lost, she was so shocked, she was so utterly bitter and completely blindsided that she couldn't even walk up to the podium to give her concession speech herself. Hillary Clinton had become the symbol of what the Democratic Party had become and what its core values consisted of. For the DNC, identity politics trumps all others, and they believed it more important to elect the first female, or just insert whatever oppressed identity group you'd like here, as president by repositioning the party to represent the interests of a coalition of minorities, upper middle class professionals living in gated communities, and powerful interests in Silicon Valley and Hollywood, than to convince working class Americans that the Democrats were still their party. Either way, and when looking at the talking points of the Democratic Party, that being open borders, amnesty for all, free health care for illegals, well, much of the party platform looks, to your average voter, to be globalist in nature and lacking much in the way of policies that can fix much of the broken and dysfunctional America that is an everyday reality to millions. The key takeaway of 2016 and going into 2020 is the abandonment of the middle class and the working classes for identity politics in the Democratic Party. Identity politics, favored for different reasons by academics and corporate interests alike, is now the central operating principle within which parties on the proverbial left, like the Democrats, now orbit. However, and as we have seen, once identity politics gain momentum, they inevitably subdivide, giving rise to ever-proliferating group identities, all of which demand recognition and their place on the victim hierarchy, which always will come at the expense of another group. LG becomes LGB, becomes LGBT, becomes LGBTQ, becomes LGBTQRSTUVWXYZ. Other letters are added to the acronym, and even the order has been rearranged as different identity groups battle in their oppression Olympics over which group is least privileged. Talk of getting rid of the G as they no longer are oppressed, or getting rid of the B as they are, by their very existence, negating the T. And no, I'm not joking on any of this. For today's woke Democrat, blindness to identity and its privilege or victimhood is the ultimate sin. And this circling the drain of political parties and the tribalization of societies can also be seen on the other side of the Atlantic. In the United Kingdom, Jeremy Corbyn, a socialist who became the Labour Party leader by accident and recently ran them into the ground in the last general election, no doubt imagines himself to be a champion of the working class. But like Nancy Pelosi and the vast majority of Democrats, this is a working class of his imagination rather than of the real world. Mr. Corbyn himself was brought up in a manor house, went to an elite prep school, and has been called the epitome of posh radicalism. He's also spent his entire life working as an MP in a constituency that has never been touched by either industrialization or by deindustrialization. What Mr. Corbyn has done is in fact presided over the tail end of the transformation of the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, from one being that champions the working class to a coalition of three main groups: ethnic minorities, particularly Muslims, public sector professionals, and radicalized millennials, most of them the university-educated children of the salaried middle class who can't get their feet on the property ladder. And like in America, identity politics as well as oppression Olympic spiraling is currently at the center of every discussion the party has. They have abandoned the working class, and the working class, as in America, has abandoned the traditional party of the so-called workers or the so-called left. Of course, the British case is different from the American case, which is different from the German case, which is different from the Canadian case. But the traditional parties of the left in virtually every country in the Western world is unified, not by the politics of old, but by a utopian messianic complex that has taken cosmopolitan globalism as the main tenets of their worldview and at all times emphasizes internationalism over national interests, group interests over shared interests, and in doing so have completely abandoned the role of representing the working and middle class voters. In the US, it was Democratic presidents that signed NAFTA and pushed for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Trade deals have pros and cons, but it has been the working class that has bore the brunt of the damage that these deals caused. In both the US and the UK, the left champions mass, uncontrolled, and unrestrained immigration along with amnesty. But again, it is the working class, both in wage stagnation and in their neighborhoods, that have to deal with the consequences of these champagne socialist political positions. Like in America, things in countries around the West are changing. The political parties currently enjoying the most success are those that espouse some combination of nationalism, populism, and economic protectionism. The old parties of the left have failed to grasp that this ideology appeals to a broad majority of the working and middle classes as well. The political tribalism in America and the constant push of identity politics by the Democratic faithful has gone over the years from inclusion to division, and in division, more division, and never-ending purity spirals. Although inclusivity is presumably still the ultimate goal, at least as a talking point, for many, the contemporary left is pointedly exclusionary, at least to the one group that it always singles out for derision. And we know who that group that the Democrats and their surrogates really dislike. And all of this political division being spewed, deplorables being created, and oppressors with their privilege being publicly castigated is coming at the very same time that a titanic demographic transformation is taking place in the hyper-diverse cities of America. The working and middle classes that are now starting to see and live with these effects of the Champagne socialist path that will completely transform their communities and society, well, they are looking for anyone that will speak to them and for them. Most are interested in safe streets, a stable economy, quality of life, and a future for their children. Things such as radicalized gender politics and pronouns, unrelenting and unending demographic transformation, the creation of an ever-dizzying arrays of phobia, ists, and isms, concocted almost daily at this point, grievance politics, the professionally offended, and the transformation of language are not that very compelling political positions to get behind for most people past the age of 25 or those people with a job who pay taxes. Now, especially when looking at the party platform of the Democrats coming up to the 2020 general, well, the true believer Democratic rank and file, as well as their elites, are in general in love with cosmopolitan globalism and are unabashedly ashamed of nationalism, but then offer little in the way of substance to most people who lack wedge identity issues. The Democrats' exclusionary identity politics is ironic in light of their vocal and ostensible demands for inclusivity, and thus more and more of the working and middle classes are going to be voting begrudgingly their lot in with the only people that actually advocate for their interests. And when I say advocate for, I do not mean the other side of the aisle cares that much more for these people than do the Democrats. They are, though, for now, at least for many, the lesser of the two evils. This is why the Democrats in the U.S. and